Welcome to the 1 Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi, chapter 5. This starts with Nephi's mother Sariah complaining to her husband Lehi about the boys taking so long and fearing that they must have died. Verse 2 says, "She also had complained against my father, telling him that he was a visionary man, saying, Behold, thou hast led us forth from the land of our inheritance, and my sons are no more, and we perish in the wilderness." This sounds a lot like what Jacob in the Bible said when he thought Joseph was presumed dead. But it also sounds to me a lot like what Joseph Smith's own mother might have said to his father on many occasions. The Smith family did not have an easy life, and the little ice age of the early 1800s meant that there were several years of crop failures and other negative, bad things like that happened in the United States and elsewhere. And the Smith family actually moved more than once because of things like this. And I can imagine many a long-suffering wife complaining in this way to their pioneering, visionary husbands who wanted to settle the West and had moved away from the relative comforts of the areas that were already settled and populated. Lehi's response is in verses 4 and 5, but it's an odd way of speaking. He says that if he weren't a visionary man, he would have not received visions from God, and says, "I should not have known the goodness of God, but had tarried at Jerusalem and had perished with my brethren," even though this is about a decade before anybody dies in Jerusalem with the destruction thereof. Also, he says, "But behold, I have obtained a land of promise." At this point, he hasn't obtained anything. He has been promised it, but hasn't obtained it, much like Abraham didn't have any of the land of Canaan during his lifetime. So Lehi is speaking of things that were supposedly at this time still yet future, but talking of them as if they were accomplished and well in the past. Further, it's a biblical contradiction to say that any land other than the land of Canaan or the land of Israel is the land of promise. It was called the land of promise or the promised land, not because it held great promise for those who lived on it, like land of milk and honey or whatever that might be applied to any fertile land such as the Americas, but it was called the land of promise because it had been promised to Abraham. The Americas were never promised to Abraham, and biblically could not be called the promised land. For what it's worth, there's also a slight difference between the 1830 and the modern Book of Mormon in this verse. Lehi says, "I have obtained a land of promise, in the which thing, singular, I do rejoice." The modern Book of Mormon has things, plural. In this instance, I would say the singular makes more sense because he's speaking of the land of promise, but I suppose an argument could be made that things, plural, would make sense, being the vision, having visions, having revelations from God, escaping death, and obtaining the land of promise, which he hadn't yet obtained. At this point, Nephi and his brothers return. The parents are thankful and, in verse 9, make a sacrifice to God, which is in violation of the law of Moses, which requires that all sacrifices be made at the tabernacle and later the temple, which of course was at Jerusalem, not 3 days' journey into the wilderness all the way to the mouth of the Red Sea, which is about 200 miles away from Jerusalem. While it was acceptable and permissible to kill animals for meat, if it was supposed to be a sacrifice to God, it was only supposed to be done at the one place which God picked, the one place where God had ordained, which would be at the tabernacle or the temple. Verses 10 through 16 detail the contents of the brass plates that Nephi and his brothers brought back, and it sounds like it contains the entirety of the Old Testament scriptures up to that point. The 5 books of Moses, and also a record of the Jews from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. which that would have to be Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and so forth and so on. And also the prophecies of the holy prophets from the beginning, even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah, and also many prophecies which have been spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah. Jeremiah would have been a contemporary of Lehi, had Lehi actually existed. The plates also give the genealogy of Lehi, so he knows he's descended from the biblical Joseph. This seems like a very out of place thing for an Israelite to be ignorant of which tribe he belonged to. At this point, Lehi was filled with the Spirit and began to prophesy concerning his seed, saying in verse 18 that these plates of brass should go forth unto all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people who were of his seed. This is another biblical contradiction, because biblically speaking, a nation, kindred, and or people were designations of descent. Israelites were Israelites because they were descended from Israel. This sentence makes about as much sense as saying it will go out to all the Israelites who are Israelites. The contents of these plates also causes problems for modern Mormons, because if Lehi had the Old Testament scriptures that were the same as our modern versions, then there is no room for Mormonism in Old Testament times. But if they're different, then the plates of brass have never gone forth to everybody like it was claimed would happen, so Lehi is a false prophet. Verse 20, it says, "And it came to pass that thus far I and my father had kept the commandments wherewith the Lord had commanded us." Yeah, except the one in the law of Moses that required sacrifice to be made at the temple, and not just any old place. So yeah, they kept it, but no, not really. They didn't.